Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we'll be looking at the secrets of supercommunicators.
Oh, yeah, I love this stuff.
We're diving into Charles Duhigg's book, Supercommunicators. Have you heard of this one?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic read, really insightful look at how we communicate.
Yeah, and I love that it's not just about understanding others, it's about becoming understood yourself.
Right, that's what makes it so powerful. So much communication advice focuses on just listening, but this is about both sides.
Exactly. And speaking of both sides, one of the first things that really grabbed my attention was this concept of neural alignment.
Oh, yeah, the matching principle. It's
So
fascinating.
is this like when you feel like you're totally on the same wavelength with someone?
Yes, it's like your brains are syncing up, almost like a dance. And Duhigg explains that it's not just a feeling, there's actual science behind it.
Okay, so how do we know this is actually happening? It sounds a little woo-woo, to be honest.
Well, there was this study where people watched a confusing movie clip together. At first, their brain activity was all over the place, but after discussing the clip, their brain scans started to align. Isn't that wild?
Wait, really? Just from talking about it?
Yep. So it really does seem like the very act of communicating, like sharing perspectives and engaging in dialogue, creates a shared understanding both in your minds and, amazingly, in your brainwaves.
That's pretty mind-blowing. But what does this actually mean for us in our everyday conversations?
Well, I think it shows us that even if we start a conversation with totally different viewpoints, that back and forth, that genuine effort to communicate can help bridge that gap.
So even if we don't agree at first, the act of communicating itself can bring us closer to understanding.
Exactly. And it makes me think about another important point Duhigg makes, that every conversation is actually a negotiation.
A negotiation. I don't usually think of it like that.
Right. We often think of negotiation as this formal thing, like when you're hammering out a business deal or something. But Duhigg says that even our casual conversations involve these subtle negotiations about what we'll talk about, how we'll interact, and what we each want to get out of the conversation.
So how do these negotiations play out in real life?
Duhigg uses a really great example of this surgeon, Dr. Befar Ade. He was incredibly skilled, but he struggled to connect with his patients.
A surgeon struggling with communication. That's so interesting.
Right. And for the longest time, he couldn't figure out why. He was giving them all the right information, but they often left feeling confused and unheard.
So what was the missing piece?
He realized he wasn't asking them a crucial question. What do you want from this conversation? It was only when he shifted the focus to understanding his patient's needs and perspectives that things really changed.
So it wasn't about the information itself, but about understanding what the other person was hoping to get out of the interaction.
Exactly. And I think we can all relate to that, right? We get so caught up in our own heads, our own agendas, that we forget to consider what the other person might want.
That's so true. It's like we're both trying to steer the conversation in different directions without even realizing it.
Precisely. So next time you're about to launch into a conversation, take a moment to pause and think about those unspoken goals. What are you hoping to achieve? What might the other person be hoping for?
It's like checking in with yourself and the other person before you even start talking.
Exactly. It can prevent so many misunderstandings and frustrations down the line.
This makes me think about how important listening is. And not just hearing the words, but really trying to understand what's behind them.
Oh, absolutely. That's what Duhigg calls the listening cure. And it's all about paying attention not just to the words, but to the emotions behind them.
Because emotions are always there, right?
Right.
Even if we're not explicitly talking about them.
Yes. Emotions are like the undercurrent of every conversation. They color how we say things, how we hear things, and how we interpret what's being said. It's like there's this whole other conversation happening beneath the surface.
It's so true. And it reminds me of that story Duhigg tells about Nick Epley, who considered himself a terrible listener until he met this counselor who really turned things around for him.
Oh, yes. What was it about that counselor that made such a difference?
Well, instead of jumping in with advice or solutions, the counselor just asked really insightful questions. Questions that made Nick reflect on his own emotions and how they were impacting his interactions. It was that shift in perspective, that ability to tune into his own feelings and motivations that made him a better listener.
That's such a great example of perspective taking. It's about trying to see the world through the other person's eyes, even if you don't agree with them.
And that's so crucial for communication, right? Because it's not just about getting your point across, it's about understanding where the other person is coming from.
Absolutely. And if you want to become a better listener, it starts with becoming more aware of your own emotions. What are you feeling? Why are you feeling that way? And how might those emotions be influencing how you're hearing the other person?
It's like checking in with yourself before you can truly check in with someone else.
Exactly. And then once you're tuned into your own emotions, you can start paying attention to those subtle cues in the other person, their tone of voice, their body language. These are all clues to what's going on beneath the surface.
It's like that saying, it's not what you say, but how you say it. All those nonverbal cues add so much meaning to our words.
They really do. And speaking of unspoken communication, Duhigg actually dives into the world of body language and emotional intelligence in the next chapter. He even tells this fascinating story about the NASA astronaut selection process. Did you know that emotional intelligence was a key factor in choosing who went to space?
NASA? Really? That's so surprising.
Yeah.
What does space travel have to do with communication?
Well, back in the 1980s, NASA realized that sending people on long-duration missions required a certain level of emotional intelligence. Imagine being stuck in a tiny capsule with someone who can't read emotional cues or handle conflict.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that could be disastrous.
Yeah.
So how did they test for emotional intelligence?
There was this one candidate who looked perfect on paper, all the right qualifications, but during his interview, he didn't ask any questions about the interviewer's own experience. It was like he was completely missing that emotional layer.
So he was missing that empathy piece.
Yeah, he wasn't showing any real interest in connecting on a human level.
That's fascinating. So they actually chose someone else who might not have been as technically skilled, but had higher emotional intelligence.
Exactly. NASA understood that in a high-pressure environment like space, emotional intelligence was just as important as technical expertise.
Wow, that's a powerful story. So if even astronauts need emotional intelligence to succeed, how can we, regular people, develop our own?
It's not as complicated as it sounds. It starts with practicing self-awareness. Pay attention to how you react in different situations and try to understand why. Make a conscious effort to see things from other people's perspectives. And most importantly, go into conversations with the intention of truly connecting with the other person.
So it's not just about exchanging information, it's about building that connection, that shared understanding.
Exactly. And speaking of connections, our next topic is one that can either make or break those connections: conflict.
Oh boy, conflict.
Yeah.
It's something we all try to avoid, but Duhigg suggests that we can actually learn to navigate it effectively and even turn disagreements into opportunities for growth. We'll explore that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back. So are you ready to tackle conflict? Because that's where we're headed next in Duhigg's book.
Oh, I don't know about ready, but I am definitely intrigued because, conflict is something most of us try to avoid at all costs.
Oh, I totally get it. It can be so uncomfortable and stressful. But what if we looked at it a little differently?
Okay, how so? I'm all ears.
Well, Duhigg presents this really fascinating research on couples and conflict. And you know what he found? Happy couples don't necessarily fight less. They just handle it differently.
Really? I would thought the secret to a happy relationship was just avoiding disagreements altogether, but that's not what the research says.
Nope. It's more about how you navigate those disagreements, those inevitable bumps in the road.
So it's less about avoiding conflict and more about weathering the storm. How do these happy couples do that?
Well, one of the key takeaways is they focus on controlling what they can control.
What do you mean?
It's about managing your own emotions, choosing the right environment for those difficult conversations, and setting clear boundaries for the conflict itself, like you're battening down the hatches before a storm,
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So instead of just letting the conflict sweep you away, you're taking steps to manage it, to make sure it doesn't get out of control.
Exactly. And one of the things these couples do really well is taking breaks when things start to get heated.
Oh yeah, that's so important. I know I've definitely said things I regret in the heat of the moment.
We all have. So they recognize that when emotions are running high, it's not the best time to try and resolve the conflict. So they step away, cool off, and come back when they're both feeling a bit more level-headed.
That makes so much sense. It's like hitting the pause button before things escalate.
Exactly. And I think that's something we can all try to do more of, not just in our personal relationships, but in all areas of our lives.
So we've talked about navigating conflict in our personal relationships, but how does this apply to, say, disagreements at work or even those broader societal conversations that can get so heated?
Well, that brings us to another fascinating aspect of communication that Duhigg explores: social identities. It's this idea that the groups we belong to, our profession, our political views, even our hobbies, can really shape how we see the world and how we communicate with others.
Oh, absolutely. We all have those groups we identify with, those tribes we we feel a sense of belonging to.
Right. And those identities can be a powerful force, both for good and for bad. They can help us build strong connections with people who share our values, but they can also create barriers when we encounter people from different tribes.
This reminds me of that story Duhigg tells about Dr. J. Rosenblum. He was a pediatrician who was trying to convince parents to vaccinate their kids, but he ran into so much resistance, even though he was coming from a place of expertise and concern.
That story is a great illustration of how our social identities can sometimes blind us to information that challenges our existing beliefs. Even Dr. Rosenblum, a medical professional, initially had some doubts about the COVID-19 vaccine because of what he was hearing within certain social groups he identified with.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Even someone with scientific training can be influenced by the social dynamics within their own tribe. So how do we navigate this complex world of social identities in our own communication? It seems like a minefield out there.
It definitely can be. But I think the first step is awareness, just recognizing how social identities influence both our own communication and the way we perceive others. And when we encounter those differing viewpoints, instead of immediately shutting down or getting defensive, try to get curious.
Curious, what do you mean?
Ask yourself, what are the values and beliefs that might be shaping this person's perspective? Why do they see the world this way? Is there any common ground we can find?
So instead of focusing on the differences, we try to find those points of connection, those shared values that can bridge the gap between our different tribes.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond those us versus them mentalities and trying to build bridges instead of walls.
I love that. It's a powerful reminder that even when we disagree, there's usually more that unites us than divides us. And speaking of finding ways to bridge those gaps, Duhigg also offers some great advice on how to make those really difficult conversations a little less, well, difficult.
Yes. And he uses a really interesting example, Netflix. They're known for having this no rules, radical honesty culture, which sounds a bit intimidating, but it actually works wonders for creating a safe space for open communication.
Wait, Netflix, the company we all know and love for binge watching. What do they know about having tough conversations?
It might seem counterintuitive, but they've found that this kind of transparency and openness actually leads to stronger relationships and better decision-making.
So how does this radical honesty actually work in practice?
Well, they encourage employees to disagree openly, even with the CEO, and they expect everyone to be transparent about their mistakes, which can be pretty scary, but it also creates a culture where people feel safe to learn and grow.
So it's about creating an environment where people feel comfortable speaking their minds, even if they're not sure they're right.
Exactly, and that kind of open dialogue leads to better ideas and more innovative solutions because everyone feels like they're part of the conversation.
It's so interesting how that works. So if we're not all working at Netflix, can we actually apply any of these principles to our own lives?
Absolutely. While we might not be able to adopt their culture wholesale, we can certainly borrow some key principles, like being more direct and honest in our feedback, focusing on specific behaviors rather than making things personal, and creating spaces where people feel safe to express dissenting opinions without fear of judgment.
So it's about creating that psychological safety net so people feel comfortable taking risks and sharing their ideas. Which makes me think back to what we were talking about earlier about how emotions play such a big role in communication, especially when it comes to conflict.
Right. As Duhigg points out, emotions can either fuel the fire or help douse the flames. It all comes down to how we manage them.
So how do we get better at controlling our emotions, especially in those heated moments? It's like I turn into a different person when I'm stressed or angry.
I think it starts with self-awareness. Recognizing those emotional triggers and developing some strategies to deal with them in a healthy way. Some people find it helpful to practice mindfulness or breathing techniques. Others might need to step away from the situation for a few minutes to gather their thoughts and calm down.
Right. It's about finding what works for you.
Yeah.
And also remembering that we can't control other people's emotions, but we can control how we react to them.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to de-escalate a situation is simply to acknowledge the other person's feelings. Even a simple statement like, "I hear that you're upset," can go a long way in diffusing tension.
Just acknowledging those feelings can make such a difference. This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground from neural alignment to emotional listening, conflict management, and even those complex social dynamics that shape our interactions.
It really is amazing how all these different aspects of communication fit together, isn't it? And you know what? Thinking about all of this makes me wonder about the impact technology has on our communication these days.
Oh, that's a great point. It's like we're living in this constantly connected world, communicating through screens more than ever before. I wonder, are we losing some of that human touch? Those subtle cues, the tone of voice, the body language, are they getting lost in translation?
It's something we all need to be thinking about, and I think it's a perfect topic to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into supercommunicators. We've covered so much ground already, but there's one more big piece of the puzzle we need to talk about: technology.
Yeah, it's impossible to ignore, right? I
Yeah.
mean, think about how much of your communication happens online or through text messages these days. It's a whole different landscape.
It really is. And it makes me wonder if we're losing some of that human touch
Hmm.
in our communication. Those subtle cues we talked about earlier, the tone of voice, the body
Oh,
language.
absolutely. It's so easy to misinterpret things when you're just reading text on a screen. You miss all those nuances that give you a better sense of what the other person is really feeling and meaning.
Oh, tell me about it. I can't even count how many times I've read a text and thought, wait, are they being sarcastic or are they mad at me? It's like you need a decoder ring.
Right. And then there's the whole challenge of building trust and connection in virtual spaces. It's one thing to have a heart to heart with someone face to face where you can really feel their presence, but it's so much harder to create that same level of intimacy online.
It's almost like we need to develop a whole new set of communication skills specifically for the digital world, like emojis for emotional intelligence or something.
Mm. Maybe that's Duhigg's next book.
Hmm.
But seriously, it's a challenge we all need to think about. How can we apply those timeless principles of connection and empathy in a world that's increasingly mediated by technology?
It's like we need to be more intentional about our communication online. Instead of just firing off quick messages, we need to take a moment to really think about how our words might be received and how we can make sure our true intentions are coming through.
Yes, it's about being mindful of the limitations of technology and finding ways to bridge those gaps. Maybe that means picking up the phone or hopping on a video call instead of relying on text when you need to have a sensitive conversation. Or maybe it means being more explicit about your emotions in your written communication, even if it feels a bit awkward at first.
Right. It's like we have to put in a bit more effort to make sure we're really connecting to make up for those missing nonverbal cues.
Exactly. And just like with any form of communication, it's important to think about your audience and the context. What's appropriate for a casual text message to a friend might not be okay for a work email or a social media post.
This whole conversation just makes me realize that communication is this constantly evolving art form. There's always something new to learn. But I think the most important thing is to remember that it's all about connecting with other human beings and trying to create understanding no matter what tools we're using.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into supercommunicators.
Yes, it's been a fascinating journey. So many great insights from Duhigg's book. We talked about neural alignment, the power of emotional listening, navigating conflict, and understanding how our social identities shape our communication. And of course, the challenges and opportunities of communicating in our digital world.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but I think the key takeaway is that we all have the potential to become better communicators. It takes practice, it takes effort, but it's a skill worth developing.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, communication is the foundation of all our relationships, both personal and professional.
So true. So as you go out into the world, remember to be mindful, be intentional, be empathetic, and maybe, just maybe, we could all become super communicators in the process. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then,